For decades, Microsoft Windows was something you bought, installed, owned, and controlled on your personal computer. You purchased a license, inserted a disk, or downloaded an ISO, installed Windows 7 or Windows XP or Windows 10, and that copy of Windows lived on your hardware. It felt like a product. It had a beginning, a middle, and eventually an end of life. But over the last several years, something fundamental has changed. Windows is no longer behaving like a traditional operating system product. Windows is becoming a service. At the very same time, the Linux world is undergoing an equally dramatic transformation in the opposite direction. Linux is no longer just an alternative desktop operating system for enthusiasts. Linux is becoming a platform. And when you compare what Microsoft is doing with Windows 11 to what projects like Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch Linux, Debian, Linux Mint, openSUSE, Pop_OS, and NixOS are building, you start to see a philosophical divergence that could define the next decade of personal computing. To understand why Windows is becoming a service, you have to look at how Microsoft now positions Windows 11. You no longer buy Windows 11 in the same way you bought Windows 7. Instead, Windows 11 is treated as a continuously updated environment. Major features are rolled out incrementally. System components are updated independently of the core OS. Edge updates on its own cycle. The Microsoft Store updates independently. Even core UI elements and system apps can change without what used to be called a new version of Windows. The operating system is no longer a static product. It is an evolving service layer tied to your Microsoft account, tied to cloud integration, tied to subscriptions like Microsoft 365, and increasingly tied to online authentication and telemetry. When you install Windows 11 today, Microsoft pushes you toward signing in with a Microsoft account. Knee Drive is integrated by default. Microsoft 365 is advertised inside the operating system. Copilot, Microsoft's AI assistant, is embedded into the system interface. Features appear and disappear based on server-side experimentation. Ads and recommendations show up in the Start menu. This is the logic of a service, not a product. A service is continuously monetized, continuously adjusted, continuously measured. A service assumes an ongoing relationship between user and provider. Windows is becoming less like something you own and more like something you access. Meanwhile, Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch Linux, Linux Mint, openSUSE, and Pop_OS are moving in a different direction. Linux is becoming a platform. And when we say platform, we mean a stable, flexible foundation upon which users and developers can build their own computing environments. Ubuntu is not pushing a mandatory cloud identity system. Fedora is not embedding advertisements into the desktop. Debian is not steering you toward a subscription bundle. Instead, distributions such as Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch Linux, and Linux Mint are refining their core responsibilities: package management, kernel stability, hardware support, developer tooling, container integration, and customization frameworks. The difference is philosophical. Microsoft is centralizing control. The Linux ecosystem is decentralizing power. Windows 11 integrates deeply with Microsoft's cloud services because Microsoft's business model increasingly revolves around subscriptions and services. Linux distributions like Arch Linux and Debian, by contrast, revolve around community governance and open standards. Fedora, sponsored by Red Hat, focuses on innovation in areas like Wayland, Pipewire, and container workflows, not on locking users into a single vendor ecosystem. Ubuntu, backed by Canonical, pushes snap packages and enterprise support, but even Ubuntu remains fundamentally open, forkable, and modifiable in ways that Windows 11 is not. Windows as a service means updates are mandatory and automatic. You do not truly choose when your system fundamentally changes. Feature updates arrive whether you want them or not. System components can be replaced behind the scenes. Hardware requirements can shift mid-cycle, as we saw with the TPM 2.0 requirement for Windows 11. In contrast, on Arch Linux, you choose when to update. On Debian Stable, you prioritize long-term reliability over bleeding-edge features. On Fedora, you get rapid innovation on a predictable release cycle. On Linux Mint, you prioritize a traditional desktop experience with stability and control. The user chooses the model. The distribution is a platform offering options, not a service imposing direction. Another major difference lies in how software is delivered. Windows increasingly emphasizes the Microsoft Store and web-based applications. Progressive web apps, subscription software, and cloud-based tools are central to Microsoft's strategy. The operating system is becoming a delivery mechanism for services. Meanwhile, Linux distributions like openSUSE, Ubuntu, and Fedora are building powerful packaging ecosystems. Flatpak, Snap, AppImage, and traditional package managers like apt, DNF, and Pacman provide multiple layers of software distribution. On Fedora, you can use DNF or Flatpak. On Ubuntu, you can use apt or Snap. On Arch Linux, you can use Pacman and ER. This diversity is a hallmark of a platform. Linux is not narrowing into a single path. It is expanding into many. Consider developer workflows. Windows now heavily promotes Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, effectively embedding Linux inside Windows to make Windows more attractive to developers. That alone is a profound signal. Microsoft recognizes that Linux is the development platform of choice. Developers build for cloud-native environments that run on Linux servers. Docker containers run on Linux. Kubernetes clusters run on Linux. GitHub workflows often assume Linux-based environments. So Windows adapts by incorporating Linux. Windows is bending toward Linux because Linux is the platform. Ubuntu dominates cloud deployments. Debian underpins countless servers. Fedora serves as a testbed for technologies that later power Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Arch Linux influences user-driven customization trends. Nix OS reimagines system configuration as declarative code. Linux Mint provides a user-friendly desktop experience that many former Windows users find intuitive. Pop_OS focuses on developers and creators with tiling window management and GPU support. Each of these Linux distributions is not just an operating system, but a foundation for building workflows, products, and ecosystems. That is what a platform looks like. When Windows was at its peak dominance in the Windows XP and Windows 7 era, it was the platform. Software was written for Windows first. Hardware was designed around Windows compatibility. Gaming revolved around DirectX. But today, gaming is increasingly cross-platform. Steam supports Linux. Proton allows Windows games to run on distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch Linux, and Linux Mint. Valve Steam Deck runs SteamOS, which is based on Arch Linux. That alone is monumental. A mainstream gaming device built on Arch Linux proves that Linux is no longer just an enthusiast's hobby, it is a commercial platform. Windows 11 integrates Xbox Game Pass and cloud gaming. Again, that is service logic. Instead of selling you a boxed copy of a game, Microsoft sells access. Linux, through projects like Proton and distributions like Arch Linux and Fedora, is becoming a viable target platform for native and compatibility-based gaming. Developers now consider Linux support because the platform has momentum. Steam's investment in Linux signals long-term viability. A service seeks recurring revenue. A platform seeks adoption and ecosystem growth. Windows increasingly optimizes for subscriptions. Linux optimizes for participation. Another important shift is hardware independence. Windows 11 has stricter hardware requirements than any previous mainstream Windows version. Older CPUs are cut off. TPM requirements exclude otherwise capable machines. This enforces a lifecycle aligned with Microsoft's security and business strategy. In contrast, distributions like Debian and Linux Mint run beautifully on older hardware. Arch Linux can be tailored to minimal systems. Ubuntu offers lightweight flavors like Xubuntu and Lubuntu. Fedora supports a wide range of hardware with cutting-edge kernel updates. Linux extends hardware life rather than shortening it. That reinforces Linux as a platform. Flexible, adaptable, enduring. Privacy is another dimension. Windows as a service relies on telemetry. Data flows back to Microsoft. Feature experiments are conducted. Recommendations are personalized. The system evolves partly based on aggregated user data. Linux distributions like Fedora, Debian, Arch Linux, and Linux Mint operate under transparent open-source principles. While Fedora has discussed opt-in telemetry proposals, everything happens publicly. You can audit the code. You can fork the project. You can build your own distribution. Ubuntu, Fedora, openSUSE, and Arch Linux all allow inspection and modification. A service collects and controls. A platform exposes and empowers. Look at configuration philosophy. Windows increasingly hides complexity behind simplified settings panels, abstracting away deeper system control. PowerShell exists, but the average user is guided toward a managed experience. On Linux distributions like Arch Linux and Gen 2, configuration is explicit. On Mix OS, the entire system can be declared in a single configuration file. On openSUSE with YaST, system management is modular and transparent. Ubuntu provides both graphical tools and terminal-based management. Fedora encourages modern tooling but leaves control intact. Linux is becoming programmable infrastructure, even on the desktop. The rise of immutable distributions further strengthens Linux as a platform. Fedora Silverblue, openSUSE MicroOS, and Ubuntu Core introduce image-based, atomic update models. These systems separate the base OS from user applications, increasing reliability while preserving flexibility through containers and Flatpaks. This approach mirrors cloud-native infrastructure practices. Linux desktop distributions are learning from server and cloud paradigms. They are becoming consistent across desktop, server, IoT, and cloud environments. That is platform thinking. Windows, by contrast, integrates cloud features into the client OS, but does not fundamentally unify Windows Server, Azure infrastructure, and Windows Desktop into a single user-controllable architecture. Instead, Azure is the service backbone, and Windows is increasingly a client for that service. Corporate control versus community governance is another contrast. Microsoft ultimately decides the direction of Windows 11. Even when feedback is gathered, the roadmap is centralized. In the Linux world, Ubuntu has Canonical, Fedora has Red Hat sponsorship, openSUSE has SUSE backing. But Debian is community-driven, Arch Linux is community-driven, Linux Mint is community-led. Pop_OS is driven by System76 but remains open. If users disagree, forks are possible. Linux thrives on plurality. Windows converges toward singularity. Even in artificial intelligence integration, we see this divergence. Microsoft embeds Copilot deeply into Windows 11, connecting local workflows to cloud-based AI services. This reinforces Windows as a service endpoint. Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, and Arch Linux allow users to choose AI tools. You can install local models. You can run open-source AI frameworks. You can avoid AI integration entirely. The platform does not dictate the service. The user decides. Enterprise computing reflects this shift as well. Servers overwhelmingly run Linux. Cloud providers build on Linux. Containers rely on Linux. Kubernetes is Linux-centric. Developers deploy to Linux. So Windows adapts by becoming more service-oriented, focusing on Azure and Microsoft 365 subscriptions. Linux expands by becoming the substrate of global infrastructure. Ubuntu Server, Debian, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux power the backend of the Internet. Fedora experiments with the technologies that will define the next generation of enterprise Linux. Arch Linux influences developer culture and bleeding-edge adoption. Linux Mint and Pop_OS bring desktop accessibility. openSUSE bridges enterprise and community innovation. When you install Ubuntu today, you are stepping into an ecosystem that spans cloud images, IoT deployments, desktop workflows, and enterprise support contracts. When you install Fedora, you are participating in a pipeline that feeds directly into enterprise Linux innovation. When you install Arch Linux, you're entering a rolling release ecosystem that gives you immediate access to upstream software. When you install Debian, you are choosing stability that underpins thousands of derivative distributions. That is platform diversity. Windows 11, in contrast, funnels users toward Microsoft Edge, Microsoft 365, OneDrive, and Azure integration. The OS is increasingly a storefront and a subscription gateway. Even Office is no longer primarily sold as a perpetual license. It is Microsoft 365. Even gaming is shifting toward Game Pass. Even AI is tied to cloud subscriptions. Windows is the access point. This does not mean Windows is bad or Linux is perfect. Windows as a service can deliver faster security patches, integrated experiences, and seamless cloud sync. Linux as a platform can overwhelm newcomers with choice and fragmentation. Ubuntu pushes Snap. Fedora emphasizes Flatpak. Arch Linux relies on Pacman and the AUR. Debian remains conservative. Linux Mint modifies Ubuntu to avoid Snap defaults. That fragmentation can confuse users. But fragmentation is also a sign of platform vitality. Multiple approaches compete and coexist. The Steam Deck is perhaps the clearest symbolic moment in this story. Valve chose Arch Linux as the base for SteamOS. Not Windows. Not a proprietary microkernel. Arch Linux. That decision validated Linux as a gaming platform. Proton compatibility layers mean Windows games run on Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, and Linux Mint with minimal friction. Gamers who once relied exclusively on Windows 10 or Windows 11 now consider Linux viable. That is platform momentum. Meanwhile, Microsoft invests heavily in Azure. Windows becomes the client front-end for Microsoft's service ecosystem. Even enterprise desktops are increasingly managed through cloud policies. Windows 365 offers cloud PCs streamed to devices. This is the ultimate expression of Windows as a service. The OS can be virtual, streamed, subscription-based. Ownership becomes secondary to access. Linux, however, is not moving towards centralized streaming. Instead, Linux distributions emphasize local control with optional cloud integration. You can run Nextcloud on Ubuntu server. You can deploy Kubernetes on Debian. You can self-host services on Fedora server. You can build immutable desktops with Fedora Silverblue or openSUSE on. The power remains distributed. In education, startups, and developer communities, Linux knowledge is increasingly foundational. Learning Git often means using a Linux terminal. Learning DevOps means understanding Linux containers. Learning cloud architecture means deploying to Ubuntu or Debian images. Even on Windows machines, developers use WSL to access Ubuntu or Debian environments. Linux is the reference environment. Windows is adapting to accommodate it. As hardware diversifies into ARM architectures, Linux again shows platform flexibility. Ubuntu runs on ARM servers. Fedora supports ARM devices. Arch Linux ARM exists. Debian supports multiple architectures robustly. Linux Mint builds on Ubuntu's multi-architecture base. Windows on ARM exists, but remains niche compared to Linux's cross-architecture presence. A platform spans hardware. A service optimizes for revenue pathways. The philosophical difference may ultimately come down to ownership versus access. When you install Arch Linux, you own the configuration. When you install Debian, you own the environment. When you install Fedora, you participate in an evolving but transparent project. When you install Ubuntu, you can customize, fork, or replace components. Linux Mint deliberately preserves traditional desktop paradigms to respect user familiarity. openSUSE offers transactional updates with user visibility. Pop_OS experiments with new desktop paradigms while remaining open source. Windows 11 increasingly assumes that Microsoft knows best. Feature updates arrive automatically. UI redesigns happen centrally. Integrations appear without explicit user demand. Telemetry informs decisions. AI is embedded. The operating system becomes less about user sovereignty and more about managed experience. In the long arc of computing history, platforms outlast services. Platforms enable ecosystems. Services depend on continued monetization. Linux has become indispensable infrastructure. Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch Linux, Linux Mint, openSUSE Pop_OS, and NixOS collectively form a constellation of innovation. They compete, collaborate, fork, merge, and iterate. They are not controlled by a single corporate roadmap. They embody open standards and shared development. Windows is not disappearing. Microsoft is not collapsing. But Windows is changing its identity. It is no longer the untouchable platform it once was. It is becoming the polished gateway into Microsoft's cloud universe. Linux, once dismissed as a hobbyist curiosity, is maturing into the universal computing substrate. When future historians look back at this era, they may not say that Linux replaced Windows on every desktop. They may instead say that Linux became the platform beneath everything, from servers to containers to gaming handhelds to developer laptops running Fedora, Ubuntu, Arch Linux, Debian, Linux Mint, or openSUSE. And they may say that Windows evolved into a service layer optimized for integration with Microsoft's broader ecosystem. The irony is profound. The open, decentralized project that began as a student's kernel experiment has become the backbone of global infrastructure. The proprietary desktop giant that once defined personal computing is repositioning itself as a service provider. Windows is becoming a service. Linux is becoming a platform. And that shift is not just technical, it is philosophical. It is economic. It is cultural. It defines who controls computing, who shapes the future, and who ultimately owns the machines we use every day.